I was sitting in the living room with my family, watching a movie on a Friday night. It was supposed to be a relaxing evening, a break from the hustle and bustle of our daily lives. My wife and kids were snuggled up next to me on the couch, and I was feeling grateful for their company. Everything seemed so peaceful, so normal. But suddenly, there was a loud noise that made us all jump. It sounded like a window breaking. We looked at each other in confusion and fear. My heart was pounding in my chest as I got up from the couch to investigate. I walked over to the window and saw that it had been shattered. And then I heard footsteps coming from inside the house. Someone had broken in. I felt a wave of panic wash over me as I realized that my family and I were in danger. I quickly made my way back to the living room and told my wife and kids to hide. I grabbed a baseball bat and headed towards the source of the noise. As I walked down the hallway, my heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. And then I saw him. The intruder. He was a tall, lanky man with wild hair and a crazed look in his eyes. He was holding a knife in his hand and was walking towards me with a menacing gait. I froze in fear, not knowing what to do. The intruder was getting closer and closer, and I knew that I was running out of time. I took a deep breath and swung the baseball bat with all my might. The bat connected with the intruder's head, and he fell to the ground with a thud. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily and trying to process what had just happened. My hands were shaking, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. But then, I heard more footsteps. I turned around to see another intruder, this one even more terrifying than the first. He was larger and more muscular, with a thick beard and tattoos covering his arms. I knew that I was outnumbered and outmatched, but I refused to give up. I charged at the second intruder, swinging the baseball bat with all my might. But he was too strong, and he knocked the bat out of my hand with ease. I stumbled backwards, trying to regain my balance. But the second intruder was relentless, and he kept coming at me with brute force. I felt his fist connect with my jaw, and I fell to the ground, dazed and disoriented. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of my family screaming in terror. I knew that I had failed them, that I had been unable to protect them from the intruders. And as the darkness consumed me, I couldn't help but wonder if we would ever make it out alive. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor, my head throbbing with pain. I struggled to open my eyes, and when I finally did, I wished that I hadn't. The first thing I saw was the second intruder, looming over me with a smirk on his face. He looked like he was enjoying every moment of this. My family was nowhere to be seen, and I couldn't help but wonder if they were still alive. The second intruder grabbed me by the collar and dragged me to my feet, his grip so tight that it hurt. "Where are they?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The intruder just laughed. "Don't worry about them," he said. "They're safe for now." I didn't believe him. I knew that he was lying, that he had probably hurt them in some way. And I knew that I had to do something, anything, to save them. But before I could even try, the second intruder hit me in the face again, sending me crashing to the ground. I felt blood trickle down my cheek, and I knew that I was in trouble. The intruder leaned over me, his breath hot on my face. "You shouldn't have fought back," he said. "Now you're going to pay." He reached for something in his pocket, and I knew that it was the knife. I closed my eyes, waiting for the worst to happen. But then, there was a sudden commotion from the other room. I heard my wife scream, and then the sound of glass breaking. The intruder cursed under his breath and ran out of the room, leaving me lying there, helpless and alone. I struggled to my feet, trying to ignore the pain. I knew that I had to find my family, to make sure that they were okay. I stumbled down the hallway, my head swimming with dizziness. And then I saw them. My wife and kids, huddled together in a corner, their faces streaked with tears. They looked up when they saw me, and relief flooded their expressions. "We have to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. "We have to go now." But as we tried to make our escape, we realized that the intruders had barricaded the doors and windows. We were trapped, with no way out. For hours, we huddled together in fear, listening to the intruders moving around outside. We could hear their voices, low and menacing, as they plotted our downfall. And then, just when we thought that all hope was lost, there was a sudden knock at the door. We looked at each other, unsure of what to do. But then my wife got up and went to answer it. And when she opened the door, we saw that it was the police. They had come to rescue us. We all cried tears of relief as the police escorted us out of the house. And as we drove away, I couldn't help but wonder how we had survived. But I knew that it was thanks to our determination, our will to survive, and a little bit of luck. As we drove away from the house, the adrenaline that had been keeping us going began to wear off. We all slumped back in our seats, exhausted and traumatized. The police asked us for our statement, but I couldn't find the words to explain what had happened. All I could do was stare out the window, lost in thought. It wasn't until we arrived at the police station that reality began to sink in. We were safe, but we had been through something that no one should ever have to experience. We were given blankets and water, and a counselor came to talk to us about what we had been through. As we sat in the waiting room, I couldn't help but replay the events of the night in my mind. I thought about the intruders, about how cold and calculating they had been. And I thought about how close we had come to losing everything. Eventually, the police told us that they had apprehended the intruders. They were part of a notorious gang that had been responsible for several break-ins and robberies in the area. They had been watching our house for weeks, waiting for the right moment to strike. I was glad that they had been caught, but it didn't bring me any closure. The memory of that night would stay with me forever, haunting me every time I closed my eyes. In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to pick up the pieces of our lives. But things were never the same. We installed the security system, but it didn't bring us any real sense of safety. The trauma of what had happened had left its mark on all of us. But through it all, we stuck together. We leaned on each other for support, and we tried to find ways to move forward. We went to therapy, we talked about our feelings, and we tried to find some sense of normalcy in our lives. And though we never forgot what had happened, we learned to live with it. We learned to appreciate the small moments of joy, to cherish our time together, and to never take our safety for granted. In the end, I realized that what had happened had made us stronger. We had survived something that we never thought we could, and we had come out the other side. And though the memory of that night would always be with us, we knew that we could face anything as long as we had each other. Months had passed since the break-in at our home, and things seemed to have returned to a sense of normalcy. However, the trauma of that night lingered in my mind and refused to let go. One night, as my family and I were watching TV, the power suddenly went out. My heart began to race as I remembered the darkness of the night when the intruders had broken in. I tried to shake the feeling and told myself that it was just a power outage, but my mind wouldn't let it go. Suddenly, we heard a noise coming from upstairs. My family froze, and we all looked at each other with fear in our eyes. We could hear footsteps slowly making their way down the stairs. It was the same slow, methodical pace that the intruders had used the night they had broken in. My father quickly grabbed a baseball bat, and my mother grabbed a flashlight. We huddled together, terrified as the footsteps continued to approach. As the intruder entered the room, we could see the outline of a figure standing in the doorway. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I could barely breathe. The figure stepped closer, and I could see that it was a man wearing a hoodie and a ski mask. My father stepped forward, brandishing the baseball bat, and demanded that he leave. The man didn't move. He just stood there, staring at us with a look of malice in his eyes. Suddenly, he lunged forward, and my father swung the bat at him. It connected with a sickening thud, and the intruder fell to the ground. We called the police, and they arrived quickly. They arrested the intruder, and we found out that he was part of the same gang that had broken into our home months earlier. They had been watching us, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike again. The fear and trauma of that night had returned with a vengeance, and it was clear that we were still not safe. We installed even more security measures, and my parents made the decision to move us to a new home in a different part of town. But the memory of those nights stayed with us, and it changed us all. We became more cautious and vigilant, always looking over our shoulders and double-checking our locks. The feeling of safety that we had once taken for granted was now gone, replaced by a constant sense of fear. In the end, we learned that the world is a dangerous and unpredictable place. And though we could take all the precautions in the world, we could never truly be safe. But we also learned that we were strong and resilient, and that we could face whatever challenges came our way as long as we had each other. As I looked around, I realized that I was no longer in my own home. The walls were a sickly shade of green, and the furniture was old and decrepit. I felt a sense of unease creeping over me, and I wondered how I had gotten here. I tried to call out for my family, but my voice was just a whisper. It was then that I noticed that the door was slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed the door open. The room on the other side was dark, and I could barely make out the outlines of the furniture. Suddenly, I felt something brush against my leg, and I let out a scream. As I looked down, I could see that it was just a cat, but the feeling of terror stayed with me. I stumbled my way through the darkness, trying to find a way out. But the room seemed to go on forever, and I felt like I was lost in a maze. Every time I thought I saw a glimmer of light, it would disappear, and I was left in the darkness once again. Suddenly, I heard a sound behind me, and I whirled around. But there was no one there. The sound had been like a whisper, but I couldn't make out any words. It was as if the walls themselves were speaking to me. I continued to stumble through the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel my breathing becoming more and more labored, and I wondered if I was going to make it out alive. But the thought of my family gave me the strength to keep going. Eventually, I stumbled out of the darkness and into a brightly lit room. But the scene before me was something out of a nightmare. My family was there, but they were all tied up, their faces twisted in fear. And standing over them was the intruder, his eyes glinting with madness. I tried to move, to scream, to do anything. But I was frozen, unable to move or speak. The intruder turned towards me, and I could feel his gaze burning into my soul. He slowly began to walk towards me, and I knew that my time had come. But suddenly, the room began to spin, and I felt myself falling. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in my own home, safe and sound. But the memory of that night stayed with me, haunting me every time I closed my eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting for me in the darkness. And though I tried to convince myself that it was just a dream, I knew deep down that it was something much more sinister. Something that I may never fully understand. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of that nightmare faded into the background of my mind. But as time went on, strange things started to happen around my house. At first, it was small things. A picture frame would be knocked over, or a door would creak open on its own. But as the days went on, the occurrences became more frequent and more ominous. One night, I woke up to the sound of scratching at my bedroom door. I thought it might be one of my pets, but as I looked down, I saw that they were both sleeping at the foot of my bed. The scratching continued, getting louder and more frantic by the second. I cautiously got out of bed and tiptoed over to the door. As I reached for the doorknob, I hesitated. What if it was the intruder, back to finish what he had started? But then I shook my head, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. I opened the door slowly, and there was nothing there. No one. Just an empty hallway. But as I turned to go back to bed, I saw a figure in the corner of my eye. It was standing at the end of the hallway, barely visible in the shadows. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure began to move towards me, and as it got closer, I could see that it was the intruder from my nightmare. He was just as twisted and demented as before, and his eyes were fixed on me with a look of pure hatred. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like I was stuck in molasses, my movements slow and sluggish. The intruder got closer and closer, until he was standing right in front of me. And then he spoke, his voice low and menacing. "I'm not done with you yet." I woke up screaming, my entire body drenched in sweat. It was just a dream, I told myself. Just a nightmare. But the feeling of dread stayed with me, like a weight on my chest. As the days went on, the occurrences in my house became more frequent and more terrifying. I would hear strange whispers in the middle of the night, and I would see shadows moving in the corners of my eyes. I tried to tell my family about it, but they just dismissed it as my imagination. They didn't believe that anything was wrong, and they refused to acknowledge the terror that was slowly taking over my life. And then one day, I came home to find my house ransacked. The furniture was overturned, and the walls were covered in strange symbols and writing that I couldn't decipher. And standing in the center of the chaos was the intruder, his eyes fixed on me with a look of triumph. I tried to run, but he was too fast. He caught me by the arm and dragged me towards the door. I could hear my family screaming in terror, but I was powerless to help them. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was tied up in a dark room, my family nowhere to be seen. The intruder was there, grinning down at me with a look of satisfaction. "You were always so easy to scare," he said. "But now, it's time for the real horror to begin." And then he plunged me into darkness once again, leaving me alone with my thoughts and my fears. I knew that I was trapped, with no way out. And I knew that the nightmare was far from over. As I sat there in the darkness, my mind racing with fear, I suddenly heard a voice. It was my own voice, but it was coming from somewhere else. "Hey, are you there?" the voice said. I couldn't believe it. Was I hearing things? Was I losing my mind? And then I saw it. A small screen, flickering in the darkness. It was a video call from my best friend, who had apparently hacked into the intruder's surveillance system. "Are you okay?" my friend asked, his voice filled with concern. I couldn't believe my luck. My best friend had saved me from certain doom. But as I started to relax, I heard something else. Something that made my blood run cold. "Who are you talking to?" a voice said, and I looked up to see the intruder standing in front of me, his eyes blazing with fury. Plot twist number 1. The intruder had been monitoring me the entire time, and now he was angry that I had found a way to communicate with the outside world. In a panic, I hung up the call and tried to plead with the intruder, telling him that I hadn't meant to betray him. But he just laughed, a cruel, guttural sound that echoed through the room. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" he said. "Well, let's see how smart you are when you're trapped in here with me." With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with my fear once again. But then something strange happened. As I looked around the room, I realized that the darkness was slowly fading away. And in its place was a bright, white light. Plot twist number 2. I had been in a coma the entire time, and the intruder was just a manifestation of my own fears and insecurities. As the light grew brighter, I saw a figure standing in front of me. It was my grandmother, who had passed away years ago. "Hello, dear," she said, her voice soft and comforting. "Don't be afraid. Everything is going to be okay." I couldn't believe it. Was my grandmother really there, or was this just another trick of my mind? But as she reached out and took my hand, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt safe. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light faded away. And standing in front of me once again was the intruder, his eyes filled with rage. Plot twist number 3. My grandmother had been a powerful spirit, and she had used her energy to protect me from the intruder. But now that her strength was spent, I was on my own once again. As the intruder approached, I closed my eyes and waited for the end. But then, just as he was about to strike, I heard a sound. It was the sound of police sirens, getting closer and closer. The intruder hesitated for just a moment, and that was all the time I needed. I broke free of my restraints and ran towards the door, bursting out into the daylight. The police were there, guns drawn, and the intruder was quickly apprehended. As I stood there, shaking and covered in sweat, I realized something. Despite all the horror and fear, I had survived. And if I could survive something like that, I could survive anything. As I stood there in the aftermath of the ordeal, the adrenaline still pumping through my veins, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. I had survived the most terrifying experience of my life, and it was finally over. But as I looked around at the shattered remnants of my home, I realized that things would never be the same again. The memories of what had happened would haunt me for the rest of my life, and I knew that I would never be able to forget the terror that I had endured. As the police finished up their investigation and the paramedics tended to my injuries, I tried to push those thoughts out of my mind. I wanted to focus on moving forward, on rebuilding my life and putting the pieces back together. But as I stepped outside into the cool night air, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a sound that I recognized all too well. The sound of footsteps, coming closer and closer. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was the intruder, the man who had terrorized me for hours on end, the man who I thought was safely behind bars. But now he was back, and he was coming for me. I tried to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I was frozen, unable to move, unable to escape. The intruder was getting closer, and I could see the madness in his eyes. He was going to kill me, I was sure of it. And then, just as he was about to grab me, I heard another sound. It was the sound of a gunshot, and the intruder fell to the ground, lifeless. I looked up and saw the police, guns drawn, standing in the street. They had been patrolling the area, and when they heard the commotion, they had rushed to my aid. As they helped me to my feet and led me away from the scene, I realized something. This nightmare wasn't over yet. The intruder might be dead, but the terror he had inflicted on me would live on, forever etched into my mind. I knew that I would never be the same again, that I would never feel truly safe in my own home. But I also knew that I had survived. And that, in some small way, gave me hope. As I was led away, I knew that my life would never be the same. But I also knew that I was a survivor, and that no matter what the future held, I would face it head on.
Thanks for watching. With you. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thank you again for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next video.